Today we've got your full in-depth comparison between the Sigma 100-400 f5-6.3 and the Tamron 150-500 f5-6.7. As usual, we're going to break these down to figure out which one's going to be better for you and your needs. Here's some specs to get you going, and if you haven't seen one of my videos before, my name's Stefan Malloch. I do a lot of photography and filmmaking news reviews and tutorials just like this, so if you do enjoy this type of content and this one helps you out, consider hitting that like and subscribe button and join the community. Anyways, we're going to dive right into the first category, which is an important one when choosing a lens like this, and that's going to be the size. So diving right into the size of these two, we'll first start with the Sigma. Now with the lens hood installed, it measures 10¼ inches long, fully extended 13¼ and without the lens hood for travel, just 7¾ inches long. At only 2.5 pounds, it is a great weight for people that fatigue easily. Now looking at the Tamron, it is a bit bigger of a lens and it has more reach, so that's kind of to be expected. As far as the overall dimensions are concerned, it does measure 10�3/8 inches long with the lens hood installed and 13�3/8 fully extended. Now for travel with the lens hood off, it measures only 8¼ inch long, so it's pretty good for what it is. Now this lens is a bit more substantial and weighs 3.8 pounds, so that is one of the main differences in terms of the size and weight of these two lenses. So again, if you are somebody that does fatigue easily, do keep that in mind. In terms of the size category, they are both a great size for what they are as individuals, but in terms of size and weight combined, I have to give it to the Sigma. So jumping in and having a look at the build between these two, they're both fairly good, but they're a little bit reversed in terms of what we expect for the most part. The Sigma line is the contemporary line and doesn't have the heft of the Art series. They both have the convenient buttons and switches you're looking for, an automatic manual focus switch, a focus limiting switch, of course your image stabilization switches, but the Sigma actually has a focus hold button where the Tamron does not. Now both lenses of course do extend as they zoom, and both have a nice quick quarter turn throw for quick target acquisition. They also share a zoom lock switch for convenience when traveling, but the Tamron does take it one step further with your typical lock, as well as the ability to pull up on your zoom ring and lock your focal length at any point. This was a feature that really grew on me over time. It's also worth mentioning that the Tamron is the only one that includes a fully adjustable and removable Arca-Swiss compatible tripod collar. Now of course this is a nice feature and you're probably going to want this if you're using a tripod at any point, so it would be an additional cost if needed for the Sigma and can get a little bit awkward without it. On the front of the Sigma you'll find 67mm filter threads, on the Tamron a much bigger 82, so consider that if you are using filters. On the back of both you'll find a nice solid metal mount, and both appear to be adequate when it comes to weather sealing. I did test both in some pretty questionable conditions, and both held up just fine in my experience. Overall, between the build of these two lenses, they're both quite good, but the edge definitely goes to the Tamron in this case. Alright, so of course it's why you're here. Let's see how these two perform now. Let's start with the aperture range of both lenses, and we'll look at the Sigma first. Wide open at 100mm, your widest aperture is f5, and unfortunately it's not long into your zoom at about 115mm where you hit the middle of your aperture range f5.6. It's not till 235mm that you get into f6.3, which is your fastest aperture all the way down to 400. This is quite typical of something in this focal range, and just a tiny bit slower than the G Master. And now let's have a look at the Tamron in comparison before we check out their focal range differences. At 150mm we start off at f5, and that's going to continue all the way to about 240mm where we hit f5.6. From 240 to 390mm it's going to be f5.6 until you hit f6.3, and that's going to continue from 390 all the way to 485, or almost the very end of our focal range. There's just a slight little bit from 485 to 500 where we hit that slowest f6.7. So a little tip for you is to just zoom all the way out to 500, back off just a tiny little bit, and lock it into place using our focal length lock to hit that f6.3. That few millimeters at the very end, you're really not going to notice a difference, and you'll get that extra third of a stop of light. So overall between the two in terms of aperture, the Tamron does have the advantage in flexibility of aperture range. Here we'll check out the difference in focal range between these two lenses and also talk about a few limitations both of these lenses have compared to the Sony natives.
Here's a quick look at the focal range differences between these two lenses. Here's the 100mm on the Sigma compared to the minimum 150mm on the Tamron. Here they are side by side, not a huge difference, but in some instances it can be quite a big deal. Now on the long end where it matters, here's 400 on the Sigma compared to 500 here on the Tamron. And again, here they are side by side to show you exactly how much more 100mm gets you. Now unfortunately, the downside with both of these lenses is that there is no teleconverter available compared to the Sony lenses where there is a 1.4 and a 2x teleconverter available for the 100-400 G Master and the 200-600. An unfortunate limitation, but be aware that you can throw either one of these into crop mode and get 1.5 times the reach. Here's some photo examples showing off the image quality and what to expect with each lens, once again starting with the Sigma 100-400. Now overall this lens is a great performer, and I'd say that optically it's very good. Now I'm not going to do a deep dive into the sharpness and optics in this video for the sake of time. For a more detailed look, make sure you check out my full in-depth review on both of these lenses. I will say that for the price, this lens does perform very well. It does have 9 aperture blades and a minimum focus distance that's really nothing special. Nonetheless, you can get quite close to your subjects and it does track quite good, as we'll check out here in autofocus in a minute. The background separation or bokeh of this lens is decent and it's sharp in the center where it counts. Now we'll have a look at some examples from the Tamron, and being a bigger, heavier, and more expensive lens, it's not surprising that it does perform a little bit better. Now it's sharper across the board, especially in the corners, and its autofocus is lightning fast. Not to say that the Sigma's a slouch, but in terms of optical quality, long story short, the Tamron's better. Now is it perfect? Absolutely not. Once again, a limitation of both of these lenses is that they're going to be capped at about 15 frames per second shooting speed by Sony. And unfortunately, if you do want to utilize the A9's 20 or the A1's 30 frames per second, you're going to have to once again go ahead and buy a Sony lens. The Tamron also has a variable minimum focus distance with a more impressive just under 2 feet at 150mm, letting you get very close and get some really macro-like shots. On the long end, it's just average. Now with 7 aperture blades, this lens's bokeh is definitely nothing special, nothing to write home about, but again, that's not why we buy these telephoto lenses. Next, let's look at perhaps the most important aspects of these lenses, the autofocus system. And they're both fairly good for what they are. Here's an example of the Sigma 100-400 at work. As you can see, I'm really putting it through its paces, as I always do in extremely low light situations, and it keeps up pretty well. Here's some real world shots, and this is my dog of course running very quickly at me, a very strenuous test for this lens, and unfortunately it doesn't really keep up too well with very fast moving subjects. That's really one of the only things that I have to nitpick about this lens is its consistency, but nothing a firmware update couldn't improve, but at this point my keeper rate for these types of shots is around 50%. So unless you're shooting very fast moving subjects or birds in flight, this lens will do just fine. Now we're having a look at the Tamron, and in terms of autofocus, it is a step up over the Sigma. Featuring Tamron's VXD focusing motors only found in the 70 to 180 right now, this thing is crazy fast. I personally find it a lot more impressive in photos rather than video, but that's not really uncommon in this type of a lens. So now diving into some real world shots once again, I find that this lens also struggles with some consistency despite having incredibly fast autofocus. And once again, I believe that with a firmware update this could definitely be improved, but it does struggle with the most difficult subjects like birds in flight. If you're shooting medium-sized or bigger subjects and not at 500mm, it tends to do a lot better, and for the average shooter this lens is going to perform fantastically. It's important to be realistic with your expectations between these two lenses, given the price. You could compare these two to the 100-400 G Master, which will be better performing and of course more consistent, but it is a lot more money. We're going to continue to roll with the Tamron right into the image stabilization tests, and unfortunately this is definitely not an aspect of this lens that blew me away. Here it is in action in terms of video, which is less than impressive. Don't get me wrong, it is a welcome feature, and it will perform a bit better in photos rather than video here, but it's definitely not going to perform as well as the Sony variants. And here's an example of the image stabilization at work in terms of photos. And as you can see here, this at 1/20th of a second here with it turned on, barely usable, and with it off the same shutter speed, you can see we're getting here now a little bit of motion blur. So it did save the day in this case. So this again is an extreme example showing you that it's definitely welcomed when it comes to photography as well as video, but it's just not going to be anything game changing. And here's a quick example of the Sigma in action. And it's along the lines of the same story. It is welcome, but it's nothing groundbreaking. Maybe a tiny bit better performing than the Tamron, but we're really splitting hairs here and nothing compared to the Sony. So as you saw, there's a lot to cover in terms of performance, and both of these lenses are packing a ton of it. We'll get into the price difference and some comparables here in a second, but as far as overall performance is concerned, I have to give the edge in most regards to the Tamron. Finally, let's touch on the value of these two lenses. Now, being third-party options, there are pros and cons. As you've seen, there are some limitations compared to the native Sony lenses, but both of these offer great warranties, and of course, they're a lot cheaper. Now, the Sigma 100-400 you can find around $899 US, which is a steal if you ask me. It has a ton of value and is going to be a great introductory telephoto lens if budget is the biggest consideration. For a bit more money, and if you don't mind the added weight and size, there's the Tamron, of course, and you can pick that up for about $1,399 US, which is still considerably less than, of course, the G Master, which is my go-to, but in the end, everybody's needs are different. Now, if you're a straight up birder or only want to shoot birds, I really recommend looking into the 200-600, as you're going to really need all the reach you can get and ideally have access to those teleconverters. But if it is going to come down to either of these two lenses, I think there's phenomenal value in both of them, and in the right hands, they can definitely produce professional results. For value, it's a win for both.
So there you have it, guys. There's my full in-depth comparison between the Sigma 100-400 DGDN and the newer Tamron 150-500. As you saw, both great options, and it's really going to come down to your specific needs. If budget is the ultimate factor, well, the Sigma is a great pickup. If budget's not a factor and you want something that performs a bit better with lightning fast AF, well, consider the Tamron. But either way, they're both great performing lenses, and honestly, I don't think either are gonna let you down. I hope this video helped you out, guys, and you enjoyed it, and if you did, consider hitting that like and subscribe button. Join the community. If you wanna pick either of these lenses up, I will drop affiliate links down there in the description for you. And like always, make mistakes, be yourself, and get out there and take some more pictures. See you next time.